Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the Old World. We've seen the Warhammer Day preview, we've seen the Bretonnian models that are coming, we've heard a bit about the concepts of the rules, and I promised to make a big prediction around the Bretonnians. So here it is. I think they will play entirely differently on the battlefield to the 6th, 7th and 8th edition. Over the next few minutes, I'll explain why. But before we do so, let's cast our minds back. Way back into the distant past when we actually played 8th edition as an active community supported by a living game. Now, Bretonnia at the time was using a 6th edition army book. It had seen very little love in the way of new models and support from Games Workshop. So there was quite a small player base. And it wasn't a particularly successful faction on the tabletop. But certainly in the UK, there was a small purple patch. I think it did quite well in South Coast GT, so you saw a bit of play for Bretonnians for a while. But generally speaking, not many players, not a lot of success on the field. And armies tended to be fairly conventional. You get a trebuchet or two, a unit of peasants to protect those trebuchets from fast cavalry, a unit of Pegasus Knights, always a unit of Pegasus Knights, and they were a proper pain. Then you'd get a mixture of Knights, Grail, Realm and Errant, depending on what flavour the individual player wanted to go for. Mobility was key. And I think that really in 8th edition, using a Bretonnian army was a high skill army. You needed to time your charges correctly, you needed to get your distances right, because with all these Landsigned Knights going in, you needed that +2 strength bonus on the charge in order to break through and get some damage done. So quite difficult, I think, to get a lot out of. Let's fast forward though, Warhammer Day, and into early 2024. What have we seen coming? Well, we've seen a Pegasus Knight BSB. Now maybe that'll be good, maybe it'll see play. I think that, however, is perhaps a bit of a red herring around the changes, because assuming rules stay similar to previous editions, it will need to go in with Pegasus Knights, flying out exposed by itself, not providing an army-wide bonus. That's the red herring. I think the key is the Foot Knights that we've seen and the BSB on foot. Now, we know that the Foot Knights come in 2 flavours. They can be sword and board or great weapon armed. I think what we're going to see is something along the lines of sword and board. Heavy armour and shield, weapon skill of about 4. Alright, toughness is only 3, but you're looking at a 4-up armour save, which could be a 3-up depending on what they do with a sword and shield combo, or it may be a 4-up armour save with a 6-up ward. Probably a decent leadership too. And that means this unit is going to be tough to crack. It's the best heavy infantry that the Bretonnians are going to be able to get hold of, and I think it changes the dynamics of how they play. Particularly when you then slap a Foot BSB in with the unit. Traditionally that gives a bubble of re-rolling leadership. Having the BSB gives a +1 to your combat resolution. And if you've got access to a magical banner that gives stubborn or something like that, then that's going to make this unit of Knights really hard to shift. You're going to have to virtually destroy them to get them to go anywhere. Then we come on to the rules concepts that we know about. Most specifically, we're looking at pushback. Now, I believe there were some rules around this in possibly 2nd or 3rd edition of Warhammer. That is before my time. But the concept as we understand it right now is combat's not going to lead to this binary position of a unit that loses combat either legs it or stands and fights. A unit may be pushed back, giving a little bit of ground, drawing the attacker in. So if you've got a reasonably high leadership unit, one that's not likely to break and flee. That gives you a lot more certainty around where units are going to end up on the battlefield at the end of your opponent's turn. And this brings in hammer and anvil tactics, something that the Bretonnians haven't really been able to do before because they've not had a reliable infantry unit that can pin the big heavy hitting enemy units in place long enough to get the countercharge going. So you've got the unit of knights possibly giving a little bit of ground, but opening the doors for flank charges with your cavalry into these big hard-hitting enemy units, which in turn also creates more of a role for the light cavalry of Bretonnia, the mounted squires, things like that, to push through, angle, and then protect the knights' flanks from being charged in turn, should they not break through the enemy. Much more combined arms feel, particularly if you've got trebuchets then lobbing rocks over the top to ruin people's days. And this is a fundamental shift in how Bretonnians play. It's not just about units freewheeling around the board, using their mobility to keep themselves out of trouble. It's about using solid units of infantry to create traps for your opponent, to make sure you can bring those knights in, crashing through, trying to cause the breakthrough, the punch through the line, get into the reserves, and cause absolute chaos. And it should be noted that this is before we know whether there's going to be secondary objectives in Warhammer the Old World. They exist in 40k, they exist in Age of Sigmar, they may well exist in some form in Warhammer the Old World, expanding on the special rules for scenarios that we saw in 8th edition to be something a little bit more functional. But hey, if you've got secondaries and you're trying to hold objectives, cavalry, they're just not going to do that for you. You need some kind of heavy infantry to help you out. So there we see a fundamental shift, I believe, in the Bretonnian playstyle, and one which I think makes the Bretonnians more dangerous and more accessible, because you've got a few more tools in the tool belt you can rely on. So newer players, they've got some infantry they can try and use to get them out of trouble and stuff like that. I'm going to finish by referencing a battle that really happened, where these sort of hammer and anvil tactics that I'm predicting worked. And that is the classic Battle of Cannae, where the heavy infantry of Rome came smashing down into the infantry of the Carthaginian army commanded by Hannibal Barca. Now, in Warhammer editions gone by, this would have led to either the Carthaginian army standing and fighting, or probably more likely in these sort of circumstances, they probably would have broken and fled, allowing the Romans to punch through and cause mayhem. But that didn't happen. The Carthaginian line was slowly pushed back, creating a salient into which was sucked more and more Roman troops. And the more they pushed into the centre, the more they allowed the opportunity to envelop them. At the same time, the superior Carthaginian cavalry saw off the Roman equivalents, and then was able to sweep down around the flanks and rear of the Roman army, wrapping it up and taking away any advantage of numbers that it had. For men in the middle of a press are completely unable to fight, whereas more Carthaginian troops were able to bring themselves to bear. The result, as is well known, a massacre of the Roman forces, a game-changing defeat for Rome, which did force it onto the defensive for some time. And it's not just Cannae where these worked. Alexander the Great is famous for his use of his phalanx blocks to support the cavalry in hammer and anvil techniques. Their stuff really works. So could these disastrous defeats now be the fate of those who stand up to the followers of the Lady of the Lake? Final thing from me to say is thank you very much for listening. Do you agree with my prediction? Are we going to see a fundamentally different Bretonnia taking to the field for Warhammer the Old World? If not, why do you disagree? What direction of travel do you think it's going to be in? Or are we going to see that same classic lineup over and over again? Let me know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video and perhaps others in the back catalogue, do consider subscribing. It's the best way of being notified of when a new video drops. They are coming out every Friday, give or take, with some additional videos along the way. All that remains to say is once more, thank you very much for listening. I am returned to the old world. Have a great day.